Hello, my name is Aurélie Ponthieu. I work as a humanitarian affairs specialist for the organization Médecins Sans Frontières, also known by the acronym MSF. I'm going to discuss here one of the recent dilemmas MSF faced while working in Greece. Its departure from the Moria hotspot on Lesbos following the adoption of the EU-Turkey deal on the 18th of March. First, I would like to give you a bit of background into MSF's work in Europe. MSF has been providing assistance to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in Europe with almost permanent presence of our teams in Italy and Greece for 15 years. In all our projects, the medical and humanitarian needs of our patients are the direct consequence of restrictive migration policies and states' inadequate responses. Our operations have, however, taken a different scale in 2015 when faced with growing needs and a failed European and national response in countries of refugees' first arrival and transit. We deployed search and rescue operations for the first time in our history, both in the central Mediterranean and Aegean seas, and the full refugee response in Greece and the Balkans, doing medical and mental health activities, but also non-food item distributions, water and sanitation, and shelter. Now we are also vaccinating refugee children in Idomeni in Greece. Our presence and the running of our operations to respond to what we describe as a policy-made humanitarian crisis triggered many dilemmas for our organization and teams on the ground. We were forced, together with volunteers and other NGOs, into full state substitution on the territory of the European Union, where our resources should not be needed. We started working in the Moria Registration Center in July 2015. When our emergency teams first arrived, the local authorities and volunteers working in what was initially the first reception center were completely overwhelmed by the sudden increase in arrivals, and the place was so full of waste that it was a health hazard. At the time it was inaugurated as a hotspot in October, following the plan of the European Commission, it was nowhere close to fulfill humanitarian or European reception standards. Despite the efforts of volunteers, NGOs, and the financial support of the European Union, the place was chronically overcrowded, and the refugees were suffering from lack of shelter, hygiene facilities, food, and swift registration procedures. The lack of medical and vulnerability screening was also a big concern, leading to extremely vulnerable people being left with no quick access to registration procedures and no adequate shelter. Most of the pathologies treated by our teams were directly related to inhuman living conditions. Our main complaint at that time was that Greek authorities and EU agencies in Moria were focusing exclusively on police and registration procedures, neglecting to put in place an asylum reception system, and failing to respond to the needs of hundreds of thousands of extremely vulnerable individuals who passed through Moria. Despite these very clear and unacceptable shortcomings, the situation was still bearable as long as people were only transiting for a few days, waiting to be registered and to move on to either the asylum and relocation system or to the Balkan route towards Northern Europe. This dramatically changed on the 18th of March, when the European Council agreed to a deal with Turkey to stem the flow of migrants and refugees arriving to Greece and return all undocumented migrants and asylum seekers which claim were to be found inadmissible back to Turkey. The deal was called Humanitarian by EU officials as it aims at stopping irregular sea arrival and consequently death at sea. In MSF views, however, this deal is all but humanitarian. In the aftermath of the European Council decision, Greek authorities evacuated the islands of the people who had arrived before March 20. All the others were forced to go to the hotspots and the gates closed on them. The hotspot became detention centers and the main implementation tool of the EU-Turkey deal. On 22nd of March, MSF released a statement announcing it had withdrawn from the Moria hotspots and suspended all related activities. If this decision was difficult to take because we knew we would be leaving our patients behind, it was taken after a close review of what was at stake in the hotspot. We decided to leave Moria because we did not want to see our presence being used as a humanitarian stamp on the EU-Turkey deal, which we consider an attack on the right to seek asylum, and an unacceptable response at a time where we faced with the worst displacement of population ever recorded in the world since World War II. Pushing refugees away is not only likely to provoke a humanitarian crisis somewhere else, in this case in pre-removal centers or by domino effect at the Syria-Turkey border, which is now closed to those fleeing Syria, but also send a very negative signal from the EU to the states receiving today most of the refugees in the world. It means it is possible to buy responsibilities away. It only takes a few billions and the declaration that the next country is safe. If this logic will be replicated by all countries in the world, there will be no more refugees. No one will be able to escape wars and persecutions. We are already seeing how this logic is influencing Kenya to close its refugee camps today. On another note, the deal opens the way to the resettlement from Turkey to Europe of one Syrian for one Syrian returned from the Greek island, up to a limit of 72,000. This cynical calculation can never be seen as a humanitarian gesture, when the only safe passage offered by the EU lies on the number of people who can be returned after risking their lives at sea. Not mentioning that this resettlement scheme is not based on refugees' needs for protection and durable solutions in Turkey, but conditioned to Turkey's ability to stem the flow to Europe. Another very disturbing aspect of the EU-Turkey deal is the fact that the financial compensations granted by the EU to Turkey through the so-called refugee facility entails humanitarian funding. As the EU-Turkey statement emphasizes, the money is conditional to Turkey respecting its engagements, mainly to stem the flow and take people back. It means humanitarian assistance is being co-opted for political reasons. This is in violation of humanitarian principles and of the European Consensus on Humanitarian Aid, which states that EU humanitarian assistance is based on needs alone and not on political agendas. With this deal, we fear humanitarian aid is becoming a border control tool. We came to the conclusion that the purpose of the hotspot has been drastically transformed by the deal. From a registration center allowing at least people to get access to asylum and relocation procedures, it was turned in a few days into a center focusing exclusively on expediting forced returns to Turkey. We feared that our humanitarian principles would be at risk would we stay in Moria. We could not accept to see our assistance being used to support mass expulsions of vulnerable people to a place of uncertainty, and as the Moria doors were closing, we decided we could not wait for the first returns and the first violations of human rights to start. We decided to leave because we knew the guarantees, the legal safeguards promised by the EU to ensure respect of the non-refoulement principle were not in place at the time the deal took effect. They are still not fully in place today. When we suspended activities, people were being detained in Moria without proper accommodation. The center can barely shelter 1,000 people. There were 3,700 people the day we left. Just before the visit of the Pope on April 16, around 1,000 vulnerable people were transferred to Karatepe, an open camp, but overcrowding remained a problem in Moria. People in Moria were also detained before the necessary legislative changes allowing for the full implementation of the deal were done, resulting in arbitrary detention, absence of any legal clarity towards people's rights in the admissibility screening to be performed by the European Asylum Office to evaluate whether someone can be returned or not to Turkey. There were no measures in place for people to get legal assistance or for lawyers to see their clients. The majority is actually not even returnable as per Greek law, either because of their vulnerability or because they are family members already in the EU that they can join through the asylum process and the Dublin regulation. Indeed, are excluded from the fast-track procedure being now applied in the hotspot a list of vulnerable groups such as pregnant women and accompanied minors, victims of torture or sexual violence. As there was no systematic vulnerability assessment in place, only visible vulnerabilities were recognized at implementation of the deal, and vulnerable people continued to be detained until the expiration of their 25 days period without any remedy. The resort to detention in Moria has been systematic unnecessary and disproportionate, and have likely increased vulnerable people's mental health suffering. There are no sufficient structures available to accommodate vulnerable people outside of the Moria Center. KRATP is full, and the volunteer-run Pikpa Center is under threat of closure by local authorities. Unaccompanied minors, after weeks of detention in Moria, have finally been transferred to the MSF-run Mentamados camp. However, these are not permanent solutions, and there's still no clarity whether non-returnable people will be transferred to the mainland or stay on Lesbos. If those who have exceeded their 25 days of detention, the maximum period allowed by the law, are now able to get out of Moria, they are still prevented to take ferries and rent hotel rooms. They are forced to sleep in Moria. Lesbos has been turned into an open-air prison where people are wandering around in a legal limbo. If the European Council was serious about its intention not to violate any human rights in the process of the EU-Turkey deal, the least we can say is that no precautions were taken to avoid it. The EU-Turkey deal has not achieved much today. A few hundreds not willing to apply for asylum have been returned. The drastic decrease in arrivals depends on Turkey's will to fulfill its part of the deal and stop refugees from reaching its coasts. This all depends on a completely different matter, whether Turkish citizens will be able to travel visa-free to the European Union. In the meantime, thousands of people in need of protection and a better life for their children are stranded in Turkey and on the Greek islands. As our experience of migratory routes has proved in the past, when one route closes, another one opens. The smugglers will adapt to the new circumstances. It is a matter of time. Summer will be there soon, with its usual waves of migration by sea from Libya to Italy. It is too early to see if the artificial closure of the eastern Mediterranean route to Greece will lead to an increase on the central Mediterranean route, but what is sure is that none of the problems leading to the 2015 crisis in Europe has been resolved. Our experience clearly shows that despite hastily built fences and barbed wire, people in need of protection will continue to find ways to reach Europe. While European leaders continue to focus on the wrong strategy, they are only exacerbating the causes of their own policy-made crisis. The lack of safe and legal channels forcing people to sea and into the hands of smugglers, and the Dublin first country of entry rule putting unfair pressure on southern European countries and forcing people to transit on unsafe journeys for Europe. There has been no response to these highly problematic deficiencies. Relocation, a safe way to exit Greece and its dysfunctional asylum and reception system, is too limited and not functioning. It is now being deprioritized for the EU-Turkey deal. The EU-Turkey deal and the deployment of EU humanitarian aid to Turkey and Greece will be no quick fix to the failing common European asylum system and the lack of political courage among EU leaders. As far as MSF is concerned, we have redeployed our search and rescue operations and stand ready for another summer of migration to Europe, at sea and on land. In this volatile and politically charged environment, we will continue to make sure our assistance does not support European countries' irresponsible and unfair agendas. Thank you for watching.